when you're presenting, but we have an issue. It's kind of quiet over here.
All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming for our presentation. Today we'll be trying to provide you with some context around the Context API. I'm Ruben Manrique. I work over at Northwestern Mutual as a full stack engineer. If you'd like to email me with any of your questions after this conference, here's my email address.
And hey, what's up, Chicago? I'm AJ Zazakowicz. I'm an engineering lead at Northwestern Mutual. At Twitter, you can find me at AJ_Zazakowicz. I tweeted in the webinar earlier, so you can find me there. And Aaron Zazakowicz, my official name, at northwesternmutual.com. And I'm going to start out by telling you guys a little bit about context. So some of you may not realize, but you probably are already using it. If you use any popular state management libraries today, such as React Redux, React Router, or MobX React, you're already using the Context API. These modules have been using the experimental release of Context for quite some time, and that's how they provide state to the components in your application. So if you want to read more about that, you can find that in the ReactJS docs under the legacy context. That's their current implementation, and I'm sure they'll be updating to the newer API soon. So what does context do for us? Context provides us a way to pass data through the component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. This is known as prop drilling. So you might already kind of get this feeling when you have a high order component that has a bunch of data in it and you need it in a component that's 3 levels down from where you're at. You have to pass that in and pass that in and pass that in until you're down to the component that you want. So context looks to solve this. Sometimes it kind of feels like Inception, where you get passed down so many levels that you forget how many levels down you are, and you don't know where this data came from. So context helps us with that. There's 3 basic parts to context. The first is the create context method. What that does is it returns a provider and consumer pair. So you call that function and it returns you a React component that allows consumers to subscribe to context changes. So anytime your context changes, any consumers underneath the provider of that context will receive the updates and re-render. And a consumer is just a React component that subscribes to the context and its changes. So we'll see a basic example of that. Hopefully you guys can see this. I can try and bring up the code panel. If not, does that look okay in Chicago? Ish. Let me share my screen and I'll try and make it bigger for you guys. All right, hopefully that's better for you guys over in Chicago. All right, so we can see here at the top of the file we have the React create context call, and we're passing in an initial value to that function. So that's going to be the initial value of the context. We get out of that call a provider and a consumer, and then we have 2 examples of implementing that context. So the first one here is without a provider. So if you have a consumer without a provider, it will use the default context instead of the provider's value that it supplies. So this might be helpful if your context is very static. If you have theming or something that you're trying to use context for that's not ever going to change, you don't really need to use providers in that case. You can just use a consumer and it will pass down context to the children components below it. The second example here you can see is using a provider. So we're passing in a new value for the context and then a consumer below that that's going to pick up that context change and any future context changes to our React context. So you can see that when it renders at the bottom, that the first one is picking up the default value, and the second one is picking up the provided value. I think questions on that? I know I went through kind of quick, but that's kind of the basic implementation.
Does anyone in Chicago?
Yeah, any questions in Chicago on that before I proceed? All right, so I will stop sharing. And, oh, now I gotta go back to slides.
Yes.
That's weird.
All right.
All right. Okay. So now let's take this a level deeper. We kind of got to this point in our research and then kind of said, okay, how can we use context at Northwestern Mutual and what can we do with it in our apps? And Ruben's going to talk about that.
All right. So as he was saying, we're going to talk about how we've implemented this over at Northwestern Mutual now. Let's go back to screen share. Okay. So over at Northwestern Mutual, one of our common architectures is we have a lot of micro apps. Each micro app, we have a lot of cookie cutter templates that we use in order to get things up and running quickly. One of our standard implementations is to use Redux along with our templates in order to do what we've been talking about with prop drilling. It works really great for a lot of our pages, but for some of our pages that are super simple, it takes a little bit of work to get a Redux store set up when you really don't have that much data you're viewing or that many changes that you're doing. So it's a bit overkill for some of the simpler things. So my team has been working on something recently for a new modal that pops up on the screen. It's quite simple and doesn't have much data to it, so I thought this would be a good chance to use the context API and see how it works. So on the screen is what we implemented with it. So when you click on a little button over here, you see over on the side a little modal pops up where you can view a list of financial representatives for the current person who's logged in at the time. If you click on one of them, it gives you a little bit of the details about them. Click back, and that's really about all it does. So it's quite simple, and all it does is grab a little bit of data. So now we can go into how I would have done this. So as I said, we have a lot of templates of how we go and try to rapidly build some things. One of our standard techniques is when it's simple data like that, we like to serve it all up on, grab all the data on the server side and then just inject it onto the page. So the first thing that I'll show you is over down on here. Sure. How do we do that? Is that good for everyone? All right. So one of the first things that we do is we just make a call to get the current representatives, and then we inject it into our state and put it into our app shell. This is then stored on the window as the window.state. So once you get to the actual JavaScript client side, you can grab that data. So then this is how we bootstrap it. This is the entry point of our React app. And over here, we're grabbing the context out of that window state that we had. We then have our entry component, and we pass that context in there. So that context is already going to be filled in with the representatives and doesn't have to call it on the client side at all. When you get into the entry point, it's very simple. I created a thing called provider, and I passed in the context that it had and wrapped the entire app with that. So as AJ showed you in the simple implementation before, the create context, you can either give it a default state or not, and then the provider itself then holds on to that value. What he showed there was a simple thing and just gave it a static value. So what I decided to do is I created a helper file called context that went in a little bit deeper and was allow you to change the values dynamically. So at the top, I have the app context using the create context. Inside here, I then create a wrapper component called provider that then has the initial state of everything that I want to keep track of inside the app. As you go down here, you can then see that I have the app context provider that was shown in the example, but instead of a static value, I use this.state. So anytime the state of this provider class gets updated, then the provider value will change and update all the consumers. So in the constructor, I take in what was passing through the context, and I set the state to that, and I combine things together and assume a couple default values. Down at the bottom, I wrote my own higher order component because a lot of people are used to what React Redux does right now with the connect method. It's a helpful way of just grabbing out of the context or out of the state only the values that you care about and not the whole state. So I wrote my own higher order component that takes a consumer or returns a consumer, but only passes back the values that you want inside of it. So an example of how this is working, as you saw in the entry point, the entire thing is wrapped inside the provider. So anywhere inside the app now, you can grab the context. So we have this page called.
Sorry,
Mhm.
sometimes I was just asking if you can make it a little larger.
A little larger? Still? Sure. Oh, that's really big. Okay. That is not the page I even want to open. So as you can see on this page, this is the component that views. Yes? Sure. There we go. And so this is the component that shows all the lists of the reps. So at the top, I import my context that I had and the method for connect that would be able to connect the data. So this is just a simple component that I wrote that just takes in some data of what we want. At the bottom, we just use the connect method and grab the context and only grab the things out of the context that we want. As you can see, we have the current active rep if there is one, the current list of reps, and then a method for showing the rep and hiding the rep if you click on one of the reps. Over inside the app entry point, we do the same thing. At the bottom, we have a connect, and we're only connecting to two simple things: is small and set small. This way we can keep track of whether it's in mobile mode or if it's in desktop mode. And these are the only two things that this cares about. That way it doesn't need the entire context and grab things through manually. I know I went through that pretty quick, but that was pretty much the base of the implementation that I did with the context here. Is there any questions at this point so far? Okay. Well, then moving back on to the. Is this where we had it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have data.
Yes.
Okay. What is your name? Here, Alan. Not that.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Let me mute my mic for a second.
No, that's not your mic.
Oh, that's not my mic.
Mute the mic.
So I'm actually a general question. So you were saying at the beginning that the old way of doing this is to kind of pass things down using props. Is that correct? Hello? Ruben, you're muted.
Yeah, so the old way would just be to pass down the props. You would have your root component that would kind of store the state of everything, and then each that would pass on the props to one component. But then, if that component might not need it, one of the child components would then need it, and you would keep passing down all the way to the component that would need it, with a lot of things in between that might not actually care about that. So this way, you don't have to keep passing props down between parent component to child component. You just connect the child component that actually cares about it and grab the values directly from the context.
Okay. So I guess what I'm wondering is, does if you start using context, does that make this method of passing down information obsolete, or are there still going to be cases where you would prefer to be passing down information?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the whole point of the context API, is so that you no longer have to do that. There's still, I'm sure, simplistic cases where if you wanted to not set up the context, you still could if it's only maybe one child down and there's not a whole lot of passing around props. But the whole idea behind the context API is so that once you're trying to pass values to a lot of different components and trying to keep them all organized in one centralized spot, you no longer have to then pass it to a lot of different things. This makes it easier to store all your values in one centralized location in one component in that state, and then take any component, no matter where it is in the tree structure, and just use that connect method that I wrote, or just the regular consumer that the provider creates, and just connect right there without having to pass things down maybe 4, 5, 6 levels.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. So now going back to the slides that we had. So now this is a little bit of a before and after look that we have. On the left side, this is how the app looked beforehand when we did our standard implementation of creating a Redux store. As you can see, we had a whole store folder that had an actions folder inside of that. We would usually specify all the actions that can happen inside the Redux store. We then had a middleware folder that had any middleware we wanted to use with Redux for tracking analytics or firing off other middle actions. We then had the reducers folder that set up the reducer for each thing that we were trying to follow, such as the meta or the current reps on the page. Then we had the selectors folder that then made it a little bit easier to grab things out of the current Redux store. On the right side, you can see I got rid of that entire folder and just replaced it with one simple file called context.js. Yes. So we actually did not come up with a way to track the metrics yet, but that's something that we're working on with the analytics team to decouple metrics analytics from the Redux store right now.
Ruben, do you mind just repeating the question?
So one of the questions that we had here is that we had some middlewares that are tracking analytics that we use at Northwestern Mutual, and seeing how I removed those middlewares, we no longer are tracking the metrics through Redux. He asked which way we implemented to take care of that, and so far we are currently in the middle of coming up with a new way of tracking the analytics. Yes?
Is there a way to maintain state through hot module reloading?
So one of the questions was maintaining state with hot module reloading, and from the documentation, it didn't show any difference in it working or not working with hot module reloading. With the current project that we have set up, it is using hot module reloading, and the state doesn't get affected by that. So it does.
I think it would be the same thing. If you make a code change that affects your provider in React Redux today, it poses your whole store and you have to refresh the page. I think it would be the same case. If you pollute your provider or your context, then you would have to refresh.
Sorry.
Don't quote me on that, but.
I don't mean to, do you mind just repeating that? So
Sure.
Next time we'll get these.
Stick my head in the computer. I was just saying, I think it would be probably pretty similar to what happens in React Redux, where if you pollute your store, a lot of times you have to refresh the page during hot module reloading. I think it would be the same case. If you pollute your context, you may have re-rendering issues for hot module reloading.
And moving on.
Cool. So now that we have context and we have this.set state and we have React Redux, when do we use this and when do we not, and what do we use where? So my kind of take on it, and Ruben and I kind of discussed this quite a bit as far as like where do we think this fits in. We think the example implementation that we gave is a great example of when to use context. To me, it's kind of a level of complexity thing. If your app is very simple and your components aren't really doing a whole lot, or this component over here doesn't really care about the data that the other components have, you could probably get away with this.set state. Set state kind of has its limitations, and I feel like each app kind of outgrows that really quickly. And context gives you another tool in the tool belt to kind of avoid having to jump immediately over to React Redux or MobX or some sort of state management system. So I think it's a really good choice if, something like this where you have a lot of static content, but then you only have a handful of interactions that you're dealing with, where state might only be updating a handful of times, or there's really only one or two actions that could update your state. Context is a really good fit for that. Don't rewrite Redux. You can see like we created the connect method, which is just some syntactic sugar over the consumer syntax that you have to write, but that's really the only thing that we replicated here. Don't try and rewrite it. If you get to a point where you're feeling like you really wish you had state management so that you could see what your actions are doing and you had that unidirectional data flow in your app, implement Redux. That's why it's there. This is not going to replace Redux. So yeah, that's kind of our take on it. The last thing that we think it's a really good use case for would be third-party libraries. So if you're developing a node module that's to be used in a React application, you could use context to do your state management rather than something like MobX or Redux, and you don't have to require your consumers to have that peer dependency on your third-party library. So we thought that was another really good reason to use context. So yeah, any other questions on that, like when to use it, when to not, that kind of thing? Anybody else find really good use cases for it? Yeah, so that's a good point. Ruben, do you still have your...
React tools itself.
Sorry, guys. Do you mind repeating the question?
So the question was, and with React Redux, you get really nice dev tools, and if you rip React Redux out, you don't get those dev tools. So can we still see your state in a really nice, digestible way? And the answer would be yes.
Yeah, so there's the other Chrome plugin is just the regular React developer tools. And inside there, if you click on, drill into the provider, you can see what the context is at any point. And then it shows you what your current state is of the context.
Do you still have your example up?
Probably.
Show that to yeah.
Actually, I'll just go to... They probably can't see anything over there.
Oh yeah, we'll share a screen real quick. We're going to show what this looks like. It's kind of a pain to do this. Screen switching thing.
Yep. Okay. I think I probably have to zoom in a little bit. Huh? Ooh, too far. So if you go over to the context provider or the provider that I created here, you have the context on the side. You can see is small set to false, and then the current reps is a data array of 4, and you can drill through that way. So that's what I've been using. Yes, correct. So yeah, there's no like separate plugin that I've seen so far that helps you visualize it a little bit better, but you can do it right. That's how I've been doing it with development. There we go.
All right, anything else on when to use it, when to not? We good? All right, Ruben's going to finish up with some gotchas.
So through developing and doing my first implementation of context and through reading the APIs, there's a couple of gotchas that I found personally and a couple that they warn you about through the API page itself. One of the gotchas AJ already touched on is the default value. If there's no parent provider to a consumer, so if you're looking through the tree of your component library, and if you don't provide a provider at the top, the context, any consumer that doesn't have a provider parent is going to use that default value that got created with the create context. If it does have a provider above it, it will use whatever the current value is of the provider. Another gotcha that there is with re-rendering. Anytime a value changes in the provider, all of the consumers that are listening to that provider will re-render. Even if a component above it tells it to not re-render, it still will re-render. So the component itself then needs to use should component update and decide whether or not it should re-render itself if it only cares about a couple of things. That also brings up another point of if your context is starting to get a little bit more complicated, feel free to break your context up into more than one provider. You can have as many providers on the page as you want, and only the consumers of that provider will update when the value changes in the provider. And then the last thing was the static provider value. So in AJ's implementation, you saw he just gave a static value for the context of a string. That could cause a couple unwanted re-renders, because if the provider itself re-renders, that value is static and makes it think that that value is new every single time the provider re-renders. So that will then cause any consumer of that provider to re-render as well. Which is why you saw in my implementation, the value of the the value of the provider was set by state, so that doesn't change unless you actually want it to change. So any questions about any of those? Well, then that concludes our presentation and opens up the floor for any general questions at all on the topic.
So one thing I just wanted to mention was that our Twitter seems to not be working. Oh, Twitter. So if anyone has any questions, we saw a couple come through and then they're just disappearing into Twitter land. So if you would like to go ahead and ask your questions the old-fashioned way with your voice, we are more than okay in answering them. So we're going to go Milwaukee first. Milwaukee, do we have any questions for Ruben and AJ? Yes.
Oh, do you want to
just repeat the question?
So one of the questions was, how have we been unit testing this? And the most honest answer is I have not run any unit tests for it yet. So, so I have not gotten to that part yet. So I would assume it's a lot like doing unit tests for Redux, where you can just compare states and doing different actions and whatnot. So yeah. So the current implementation that I have right now, I don't have any unit tests for. So.
And then Chicago, do you guys have any questions? We know you do. It's okay to ask them. Ruben's really nice.
We have one question. I have Dave. My question is, I noticed that you have small properties on content. I'm wondering
Does he want to type his question in the chat? We're just getting a little interference here.
sorry about that. We're gonna.
No, that's okay. It's we've got some echoing, and we just. How did Ruben get so handsome? Is that the question, or I'm kidding? What's the best beer in Milwaukee? We can talk about that all day long.
Can you hear us now?
That's a little better.
A little better.
Yeah, that's better.
We could try. We could try again.
Small property under context, and I was wondering how you're detecting it, and based on screen width, you're using local squaring. Wanted to know if you could walk me through how you're detecting it.
Let's try. Okay, now we're gonna do this. We're gonna switch our speaker off and try that again. Sorry to make you repeat it again. We apologize. Thank you for bearing with us. Your question is important. Okay.
So my question.
Yes.
That you have property. And I was wondering.
Oh, so sorry, we're getting a delay. Do you mind typing it? Like you probably, I know. He's like, oh, questions, and we want to answer your question, and it's really so. If you just, we know you're really a fast typer.
this works better for right now.
I know. I think maybe we're just getting like a bit of delay on your mic, Bill. Testing. So we know these things aren't always perfect, but the thing is that we are doing it, and that's what matters. We lost our questionnaire, our question.
Well, can you while you're not talking?
Oh, it's more property.
Toggling on and off and mute. I think that's
We'll agree on the context and how we determine that.
Oh, sure. So yes, the question that I finally can see is small property on the context, and how do you determine that? So yes, is small is on the context, and let me switch back over to that for you. Is that show? And so on the app setting itself, if you go over to the context, we have at the top over here is small, and is small is by default set to false. Then we have a method called set small that allows us to set it anytime we want. So over in the app, we have pulling is small and set small. And over here, we call set small by a handle message in the message name over here. So this gets called while binding on the constructor, and this is one of the things that gets fired when you add an event listener and remove the event listener. So this is the way that this is actually added is this project of ours is actually viewed in an iframe. And so that value actually gets passed through by a different part of the app. So in this app itself, it is not actually getting added, but it's actually getting added to the window so other parts of the application can call that. Does that hopefully answer your question?
thumbs up. Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, no problem. Let's go back to, I guess I don't need to go back to my slides, but I can stop sharing.
Okay, so now what we're gonna do, so remember everyone at whichever location you're at. If you're at Chicago, we're gonna have Chicago, Milwaukee. Afterwards, we are continuing to do our networking, and I think Chicago is gonna be doing the same thing. So as you can tell, Ruben's a lot taller than I am, so not showing up in your video. So why don't we go ahead and do that, Bill, and we'll get ready to hear Tyson. So if anyone wants to get another drink, or it should be. All right, sweet. Are you all set?
Yep. So just give us 1 or 2 minutes while we switch over.
Yep, perfect. We're gonna turn on our speaker. We're gonna switch speakers and just yeah. We can switch this camera off. Samsung. Turn my mic off.
I don't. I think we're good to go. I think they just disconnected for a second.
Yeah, we were just going to test now. Okay, can you hear us? We are here.
Yeah, we can hear you guys. Go for it.
Hi, we're here.
Hey, we can hear you guys. Go for it.
But hey, so the first time, I mean, it's to be expected. No, I mean, I already get to know. Hoping to do better this time, you know? Yeah. The internet works. If you're smart.
I just need to type something.
Yeah. It's going all that way. She said it sounds good.
Oh, she said it sounds good. Get goals texting with that.
Would you be able to ask them if they can turn up their? I don't think the speaker is quiet. I think it's that their microphone volume is kind of low. I think, you know what I'm saying, like in the Mac settings.
It's an issue no more, right?
No, because it doesn't matter.
Just if they ask questions. Maybe
Yeah.
we can't hear you.
I think it'd be for.
What up, homie?
Business cards,
Of course. I'm right next to mine.
cool. I'm gonna go put them around. If you also want to give out your business cards and say final questions to Monica,
Perfect.
just say.
We do have to get over here for anybody leaves.
All right, it's
All right. 30 seconds. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I was talking about
Get started. Love you, buddy.
Yeah, right.
Hey guys, I think we're about to get started here. So if folks want to make their way back to their seats, that'd be very appreciated. Man, we could use the other TV. It's too bad. Can I get a thumbs up if you can hear me in the back? No. Awesome. Sounds good. Sounds like we're just about ready to get started. Give folks a couple more seconds to get back from the kitchen. Alrighty. So while people are still getting settled, hey guys, my name is Ty. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it. I'm the technology principal here at Inspire 11. And Inspire 11 is a group of generalist engineers that have a wide range of experience in both kind of startup and enterprise, working in different verticals. For the past few years, I've been working mostly on building out complex declarative stateful user interfaces using things like React, Redux, and all of the good JavaScript fanciness that there is. Before that, I was a big fan of Marinette and Backbone. I also have a good amount of experience kind of on the back-end side of things, a little bit of DevOps experience. Previous to coming over to Inspire, I built and sold a technology consulting company called Lambda Consulting. A couple of our ex-engineers are here. Hi, Colin. And before that, worked at a couple startups and in enterprise consulting as well. So kind of just all over the place there. Before we get started, and while people are still getting settled, shameless pitch about Inspire, kind of what we do. By the way, if anybody, go ahead.
How did you come up with the name Inspire 11?
So let's say, Colin, do you want to tell that story? I'm gonna let Colin tell the story.
You're the one wearing the microphone, so
That's a good one. You can talk into it.
okay. I'll just
Maybe
I'll put my head against your chest like I like to do on weekends. The company is called Inspire 11 because of a little movie called This Is Spinal Tap. The co-founders of our company like that movie, and there's the famous scene where they say that they need to make an amp that goes to 11. I'm not going to imitate the accent. I wouldn't do a good job.
You should try.
But Nigel and his mates. If you haven't seen the movie, you wouldn't really get it. But the whole point is that we're inspired, and we want to get inspired, and we want to do everything to 11 for our clients. So
10 is not enough.
10 is not enough.
Never has been.
It's really that simple.
Awesome. Cool. So a little bit about us, who we are. So we're a full service digital agency consultancy that offers strategy, management, digital and analytics capabilities. We're a pretty elite team of engineers. So if folks are interested in learning more about Inspire or about what we do, either come find myself after, talk to Colin or Monica, the woman over there in the pink dress you can't see, and we can start chatting. Awesome. So let's get down to it. So the theme of the talk that we're giving tonight is offline access with React Native. And I think it's really important to start with a question, which is, what does a good offline experience mean to our users? Are you going to be the kind of person that builds an app that if you're offline, maybe shows an infinite loading spinner and breaks? Or are we going to think of a graceful user experience that's going to fall back in a nice way and let the users know that we're offline and not do anything too crazy? And in order to answer that question, there's a bunch of other things that we should consider on top of that. What does it mean to be truly offline, for example? Maybe it's the case that we're in an airport and we're connected to those terrible free Wi-Fi networks, but we're not actually connected, but it says we are. We can't send and receive data. What is a good offline experience? If a user is offline, well, how do we save data for later, right? We don't want to lose that data. We want to make it and save it in a usable format so that later on down the road we can do stuff with that data. How do we integrate nicely with third-party libs that we probably all love and like to use, like Redux Form? It's not as straightforward as you'd think. And then I guess last 2 points. One is, how do we create a good developer experience? We want to keep our sanity while we're doing this. And then the very last question that I was thinking of when putting together this little presentation is, should we automatically try and do stuff when a user comes back online? And for this example, it actually proved to be a little bit complex and it would have taken too long to go through that. So for this very simple example, no, but it's pretty straightforward and we can talk about that later if folks have questions. Awesome. So high level overview of stuff you'll see in this talk. Obviously, since we're talking about React Native, a little bit of React Native, minimal native base, minimal, recompose, Redux Form, minimal higher order components. Really tonight, what we're talking about is React Native Offline, which is a wonderful little library I'll get into in a moment, and a very popular library for persistence called Redux Persist. For those that don't know what higher order components are, show of hands, how many folks in the room know what higher order components are and use them on a regular basis? Okay, so just a handful. A higher order component, just for those that don't know, is essentially a function that takes in a component, does stuff to that component, and then returns that component. Maybe it's the case that you want to massage your props that are being passed to that component and do fancy stuff to them so that the base component inherits things that it wouldn't otherwise inherit. Just a very interesting and good composition pattern that we think is very powerful here at Inspire and that we like to use a lot. So let's dive right in. So step number one in, kind of as we're conceptualizing how to do this is knowing if we're offline and then doing stuff depending on that, right? So in kind of, first approaching this problem and Googling around, I obviously React Native, for those that have used it, has this wonderful little utility called netinfo, but it didn't seem like it was very robust. It didn't seem like it was going to be able to solve perfectly the problem that we needed. So I did some Googling around and I found this awesome little library called React Native Offline. And it's built as a handy tool belt for those that can't read to nicely deal with online, offline connectivity in React Native apps. Smooth Redux integration, which I love. That's awesome. And those of you that have had to build out connectivity dependent apps before, might be asking that question of, well, why not just use netinfo? React Native does ship with this netinfo module, and it's great in order to detect connectivity, but the API is pretty basic. And while it's sufficient for small apps, it gets kind of cumbersome as you grow. And besides that, it only detects network connectivity. It does not guarantee internet access. So it can provide a false positive. Maybe it's the case that you're not really connected, but you think you are, and you try and save something, and oh, you lost your data. Not a good idea. So let's talk about what React Native Offline is and how it works. So like we talked about, this uses the netinfo module under the hood. We talked about kind of the downsides of, we can't guarantee an exchange of data using the simple netinfo API. And the secret to React Native Offline, one of its many secrets, is it actually checks to see if you have connectivity, if you can exchange data, by sending a simple head request. So it'll basically ping a remote server of your choice. And then based on that, and if you get data back from that, you'll see that you're actually online. Another plus that we love at Inspire is that it integrates nicely with Redux. We typically will either use Apollo if we're using GraphQL, or Redux for our React applications. So it works nicely with that. And while React Native Offline has a bunch of different awesome utility methods and things like very advanced offline queues and deep integration into kind of your Redux store. The very simple example that we'll take a look at tonight just deals with a higher order function that ships with React Native Offline called with network connectivity. So let's take a look at what this is. So this is built as a higher order function that returns a higher order component. So we talked about higher order functions and components a little bit previously. Basically, this is a nice composition pattern that we can use if we want to use something like recompose, which we'll see in a sec, to go off and just do things in a way that make it so we don't have to repeat our code a bunch of times and just save us a lot of headache. And we can see that this is a very simple config that this takes. You can say if you're using Redux, in our case we're not, there's a timeout, 3 seconds, 3,000 milliseconds to default. You can set the server URL that you want to ping, and then it has a couple more configs that we're not going to worry about now. So let's take a look at how one would actually implement this. So imagine in your minds for a sec that this is a homepage component for some app. And there's a lot going on here, and we'll walk through the important parts in a sec. But as I'm talking, feel free to read through this code and just familiarize yourself. So the magic is happening here in this line where we're importing with network connectivity from React Native Offline, this right here. Then we're importing a bunch of methods from a library called recompose. If you don't know what that is, don't worry too much. But basically all we're doing is we are composing a set of higher order components, which is a very, very useful composition pattern, where we take in a connect function, basic Redux, we're connecting our app to the Redux store, and then we're passing in this with network connectivity higher order function right here. We're just chaining it together. And this compose method from recompose is, if you guys do any functional programming, it's kind of just like a flow method. So for example, Lodash has a flow method where we'll just kind of do everything that is passed to it in the order that it's passed. So we're just basically composing an enhancer from all these different higher order components. And the end result is this thing down here called enhanced wrapper. And all this is doing is it's rendering this home page content, which is a very, very simple dumb component that we'll see in a second, and just passing in the props. And the props in this very simple case right here there's just one prop. It's is connected. That's all it is. So moving over to the actual UI code that we have here, we can see that, we're all homepage content is a very simple button. And we're using the is connected prop in order to do things like disable the button. We can, maybe add a different style to the button if the app is offline in order to go off and change the text color of the button to make it look nice. My throat is dry. Put that back in, because it's gonna go to sleep. So another thing that we can do is, maybe if we're offline, we want to show a different message, right? The button should say offline or online or offline. This is just a very simple prop. It's a Boolean. And based on that, we can begin to create a good user experience, right? This is a very contrived and small example. And obviously in the real world, we probably want to do a whole lot more, right? We want to add different messages, maybe a header on the top. But, in this case, we're basically disabling the submit of a button until the user is online. Awesome. So that's kind of the first portion, just the simple being offline, what being offline means, how we can detect really if we're offline. Any folks have any questions in regard to that first one? Yes, Alex?
Just when you were talking about higher order functions and components, you said you had a higher order function that returns a higher order component. Just to clarify, would it be the case though that all higher order components are higher order functions?
Yeah, sorry. So
are all higher order components higher order functions?
Well, the question is, are all higher order components higher order functions? Colin, do you want to take a stab at answering that?
Well, technically, all React components are functions, and I don't think prior to ES6, obviously all JavaScript classes were functions. So it's kind of an interesting question. A higher order function is just a function that returns a function.
Right.
That's all it is. So a higher order component, I think it is fair to say that
it takes a component and returns that component.
Yeah,
that's at least my understanding.
It's like it's almost like a philosophical question. I think the answer would technically be yes, but I'm gonna weasel out on the technicality that like a dumb component is a function. So that would be my weasel answer. don't know. What do you think? I mean,
Oh, I think that's good.
yeah, you have a better understanding of HTTP.
Okay, so that sums up just the very simple first part of just simply determining if a user is online and if they're not, showing a different state in the actual UI code in order to more effectively go off and have a better experience for that user. Any questions from Milwaukee? And by the way, we can't hear you right now if you do. We'll wait for a couple seconds just in case. They're good? Okay, awesome. Cool.
Thank you.
Awesome. So moving forward into kind of the next step of things, the next thing that we need to do is we need to somehow save this data so that when we, go offline, we're able to save data that's entered. And when we come back online, we need that data to flow back into our application and be able to use it. And kind of the de facto standard for Redux applications for doing this, is a very popular library. We can see, you can't really see, but it has about, I think, 5,700 stars at the time of the screenshot, called Redux Persist. And Redux Persist, let's talk about kind of what it is and how it works. Redux Persist basically allows us to take our reducer state and, on the browser, it'll basically save that reducer state to local storage. And for a native device, it'll save that into async storage, so a database on the phone itself. A really nice thing about Redux Form is that Redux Persist is that we can be highly selective when it comes to what we want to save and how. So maybe we want to save certain reducers and the contents of those reducers. Maybe we want to blacklist certain reducers and not save data for those. Maybe we only want to save some portion of data. It allows us a lot of flexibility to make that happen. It also allows us to define how, when data is being rehydrated back into the app from the storage method, define how that works, what data is overwritten, what data wins, kind of how that merge process looks like. And another very useful feature of Redux Persist is it allows us to completely customize how data is saved and then how it's hydrated. For example, if you try and, so when the data is saved, we turn it into just a string, we stringify it. And, at least to my knowledge, if you try and stringify like a set in JavaScript, that'll just result in an empty object. And that's not probably the behavior that you want. So with these transforms, we're able to go off and do things when the data is inbound to be saved and outbound to be rehydrated in a way that makes it extremely useful. So basically how this all comes together is when your app launches, Redux sets an initial state, and then shortly after, Redux Persist retrieves your persisted data from storage, and your persisted data then can override the initial state that you had. That's kind of how it works from a high level. So let's take a look at a very important part, which I'll touch on in a kind of a gotcha coming up. These are just from the Redux Persist docs, which are the state reconcilers. And there's a link at the bottom to kind of the documentation for this. There's 3 different methods that can be used here. There's a hard set, which basically means that the incoming states, the state that's saved by Redux Persist, will automatically override any initial state that is in your Redux app currently, meaning it'll blow anything away. This, might not be the desirable behavior for your app. So the default is what's called auto merge level 1. And what this will do is it'll take any incoming state and merge one key down. So if I have, a foo key in my incoming state and an initial state with a foo and a bar key, what this will do is override the foo key in the initial state with the incoming foo key, resulting in kind of a merge state where we have foo is incoming foo and bar is kind of initial bar there. Then there's the last level of kind of the state reconcilers that they have, which are auto merge level 2. And what this will do is it'll merge incoming state with your initial state so that you kind of have an amalgamation and mix of state. This can be the desired behavior for some apps and can be very useful if you want. So let's take a look at an example of how this all comes together, and maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. So for those of you that are familiar with Redux, here is kind of your just, vanilla configure store.js file. We can see that it's a lot the same, but there's a little bit of other stuff going on. Let's touch on that right now. So we can see that we're requiring a few things from Redux Persist. A couple methods to create store and persist reducer, and storage, which in the browser, it says defaults to local storage, and for the web, uses async storage. So all we're doing is we're creating a persist config, which tells us how we want to be configuring our data to be saved. And then we have this persisted reducer, which takes in the root reducer, which for those of you who aren't familiar with that are not familiar with Redux, that's basically just going to be a combination of all your different reducers. And all it's doing then is exporting this as an object where we have the store, which is using the create store method on the persisted reducer, and the persister, which is persisting the store essentially, and then exporting both those to be used. And kind of the magic and the really nice thing that they do for Redux specifically is if we take a look at your actual app.js file, they have this thing called persistgate. And what persistgate does is it delays the rendering of your app's UI until your persisted state has been retrieved and saved to Redux. So the persistgate, just as an example, the persistgate loading prop here can take any React component. So for example, if we had a loading component, it could take that. So it's a really nice user experience, as we're fetching the data just to show some sort of loading indicator or something. In this very simple case, we didn't need to, but it's just a nice way to delay loading until the UI is completely ready and good to go. Awesome. So that's the simple version of how to get this all hooked up and working. There's a little bit more nuance and a couple of gotchas that I'd like to get into. Any folks have any questions so far? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with as far as performance, something like the Redux, if you're using like Redux form and you keep typing, does it debounce the saves to like the Redux persist, or how frequently does it save to local storage?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would need to look up the specific. Oh yeah, absolutely. So the question was, if you're using something like Redux form to store the form state of your application, are there any performance implications of doing this? For example, is it persisting this to local storage on an interval that, a user would notice, or is there some sort of degradation that occurs? And we've noticed that there's not. I'm not sure under the hood the, amount of milliseconds that's, the debounce occurs for in order to save this data. But we have a pretty hairy form state for this application that we're building. It's in fact it's a series of several pages of forms. And each form has, 10, 20 questions on them. And we've noticed, not a whole lot of performance degradation. It's really not even noticeable to the end user. That's a really good question.
Yeah, I use a simple, I create something small statement. So, but I look at it.
Thanks. That's awesome.
Great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Anything else?
Anything from Milwaukee?
Milwaukee, any folks have any questions on your end?
And if you're talking, you're muted. No questions.
Sounds
Great.
like
Okay.
Okay, cool. So let's move on to a couple interesting things that we had to deal with. The first is to get it working with Redux form. So I was really happy when I hooked it up, and it was so simple to hook up. I was like, wow, this must be too good to be true. And it turned out it was a little bit too good to be true. Apologies, my slide is slightly misformatted on this. But basically what we were doing is, as we're typing, we would, save these values to the form reducer with Redux form. And, this example here, there's just one value in this form reducer. And the title is some field value, and it's got a data associated with it. The problem was when we saved, this data was disappearing. And, we were kind of interested in why this was happening. And it turns out that the form reducer was reinitializing itself and ignoring the values that were stored under the form key in async storage by Redux persist. And everything was essentially getting blown away, which was not ideal. But the good news is that Redux persist gives a very easy and valuable solution to help deal with problems like these. So the solution is to write a transform to populate the initial values on hydration of the app when the app comes back online and the data is put back in the store. And when you really think about it, this is kind of the same thing, if you're familiar with Redux form, they'd want to do if you were, getting data from a remote server and trying to load it in, right? We'd get data. If we want to have the form have initial values, we put that in the initial values, everything would render, it'd be good to go. Go ahead.
Is hydrating the app a standard expression?
So I know that in the context of like isomorphic rendering it is. That's just kind of what I called it here. I believe it is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's especially used when you're talking about data-driven UI. So, I mean, this is all I've heard it in context of, and it was kind of I don't remember hearing it before that.
Can we repeat the question?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Sorry, great
So
question.
yeah, the question that Colin started answering was, is hydrating kind of the standard name for something like this, for the behavior that we're trying to exhibit here?
Yeah, it's definitely that concept of like pouring data onto something that was like, if you think of the way I always thought of it was those little like shrink wrap towels that you'd get, and then you'd pour water in them and they'd expand. So the idea is that you're taking a dry dumb component and you're pouring data into it, and then it's its full form. I think that's the idea. Not trying to mislead with it, but I do think we've definitely heard it before. So we can maybe define it the next time we give this talk.
Absolutely. Awesome. Cool. So let's take a look at what transforms are and how they work. So if you take a look at this code here, you'll see that, this is an animated slide, so it's not completely working, but this is the same file that create store was before. And all I've done is I've zoomed in the create store file to some new code, which is called transform initial values. And we can see that what this is it's using a method called create transform, which we're requiring from Redux persist. And we're seeing that for the inbound state, so for when the data is actually being saved to to Redux persist. I keep saying those interchangeably. We're not doing anything. We're basically just using the inbound state and creating a new object with that state. But when the data is now being taken out and put back into our application, there's a few things we need to do to make this happen. So the first is the data is being stored in async storage as JSON, so we need to parse that. And the second is, in this case, if we take a look at the very bottom of the file, we'll see that at right here where it says whitelist homepage, we'll see that basically this transform is being run specifically for the homepage reducer. So this outbound state here corresponds specifically to the state for the homepage reducer. So we want all the state that was previously there. That's great. But in this case, we want to grab the parse form, the values from there, and actually put those into the initial values. If we do something like this, when the app reloads, the information that we have stored in async storage will get automatically loaded back into Redux, and we'll have availability to an initial values object, which will contain all our initial values for the apps. Somebody could use this app, and let's think of something like a construction app, right? Maybe you're a construction worker, you're out in the field, you're taking a bunch of pictures, you're entering a bunch of data, and you close the app because why not? Well, all those have now been saved to Redux persist. When they come back online and they want to see this form later, maybe to submit it when they have internet connectivity, if they were on a remote job site, they can go off, they can see those are passed into the initial values, and they're part of the state of the homepage reducer. So that's kind of how that portion right there works. The very last thing that I'd love to touch on is just creating a solid dev experience, right? We should like the tools that we're using. They should hopefully work. And there was a gotcha that we kind of learned that we'd love to go over right now, specifically in regard to the state reconcilers. And this is the naive way that we solved it, and then we realized we could solve it in a simpler way. So the problem that we encountered was, it even changes the emojis. The problem that we encountered was that when we would add things to a reducer, right? So look at the top example. The initial way that this reducer was, say that this is our homepage reducer, was we had a key of foo and a key of bar, and they had the corresponding values. But if we add another key, if we add baz to that, and we saved, we noticed that the actual state that was getting rehydrated and the state of the application did not contain a key of baz in it. So it was missing that. So we're like, all right, what the heck is happening here? And we realized that we had the wrong merge strategy for Redux persist, where we were using auto merge level 1 instead of auto merge level 2. And rather than change that configuration of how that was working, we basically went off and we did something like this, where we added a whitelist with a key of a reducer that just did not exist. And remember, one of the nice things about Redux persist is we can say only which data we want to save. So in this case, there is no such thing as the foo reducer. It does not exist. This is something that we've made up. we're saying, hey, only save the food reducer. So that means only the data that would be stored in a reducer under foo would be saved. And in this case, that doesn't exist. So it basically just blows away all the data from Redux persist and then saves the new keys in there. A much simpler way that we learned to do this is just changing that auto merge strategy to level 2. But that's what we get for not reading the docs. Awesome. So that's mostly it. There's a few resources at the end here for just getting started with Redux persist, React Native offline. I also took the code for this talk and put it on GitHub in case people are interested in seeing those examples. So it's on there. Feel free to grab it. But that's all I got. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Any final questions, thoughts from the group? Either go ahead.
Remark, which is I wish you would have a hand-drawn slide showing the different merge strategies. That's all.
That could be a really good thing. Yeah, I agree. So the question was to have kind of a more clear slide on the different merge strategies. Definitely, I can put something together in GitHub for that.
Just how often you clear your data from local storage? Like if I log in a year later, might exist in Hybrid with the same thing?
It will, as long as the app has not been deleted from the phone. In that case. Oh, sorry. So I keep forgetting to do that also. So the question was, how long is this data persisting? Right? Is there a limit? Does the data Okay, gotcha. So sorry, I'm getting some echo. And whoever has muted, unmuted, mute. Awesome, thanks. The question is basically how long do we keep this data in local storage? Do we blow it away? Is it there a year later if we go back? And the answer is right now it is. It's always there. Unless the user deletes the app from their phone, that data will be saved using async storage locally, and it should be available. But it's worth noting that in our specific case, we were just very careful around how we kind of manage that. So when a user submitted the form, we would simply get rid of the data in the form reducer. It would be gone. And thusly, the data in Redux persist would also update to be gone. So we didn't really run into too many issues where we should have data where it shouldn't be. We were just very cognizant about kind of how we used it and the different reducers that would be saved.
Cool. Any other questions? Any questions from Milwaukee?
Sure. What was your greatest frustration while you were figuring this stuff out?
Yeah. So the question is, what was the greatest frustration while we were kind of figuring this stuff out? And I think that's a really awesome question to talk about. When you have to, and this, I haven't done a ton of mobile development. Colin has done a lot more than me. So, aside from kind of some of the native gotchas, one of the things that was really frustrating was just understanding holistically how this all comes together, right? How do I integrate third-party libs? How do I integrate, better offline access, really knowing if we're offline? And there wasn't really one place I could go to find all the answers, right? Redux persist is great if we want to store our state in some capability to retrieve it later. Tools like React Native Offline are great if we want to understand if we're truly offline. Using Redux Form is awesome, but there's no clear guide as to how to kind of use that in an appropriate way. And as I'm sure you're all aware, being JavaScript developers, the state of our ecosystem is crazy. Things are changing on the week to week, right? I mean, I don't even know what version of Webpack we're on right now, and it's pretty nuts. So I think keeping abreast of kind of all the changes and understanding from a big picture how to all do this together was a little bit challenging. And I really hope that this talk has given folks kind of a good starting place and a guide if they wish to kind of implement some of these things on their own. Yes. Aspirin will be your friend. Maybe a couple Miller High Lifes too.
We have a question from Milwaukee.
Awesome.
If you want to expose the panel there, you read it.
Cool. How do we do this here? Okay, cool.
Go to the presenter.
Where's the presenters? All right, cool. So the question, just to read it for folks that can't see in the back. With Redux persist, the data in async storage is not guaranteed to be there, correct? Have you had to handle loss of your persisted store when you did not expect it? Another really great question. So we've actually not run into a situation right now where the data has not been there. I'm not sure natively iOS versus Android. It's SQLite on Android that it's stored in?
Yeah, I believe it's SQLite on both of the platforms, but that's completely abstracted away. Async storage is a React Native API that binds under the hood. So obviously you wouldn't expect the SQLite store to disappear or the file. I think it really, this point comes back to if the app's uninstalled, it could potentially get erased. There's actually, if you want to delve one layer deeper, there's some interesting thoughts that I might have as I'm trying to like puzzle through this around like when your phone updates the operating system, if you decide or choose to, there's a new thing in iOS, I think it was in iOS 10, but it's being expanded on in iOS 11, and I'm sure there's one similar on the Android side that allows you to have your application data persisted to the cloud for apps that you use less frequently. But we would assume then that would get stored in the iCloud account, brought back down when the app is re-downloaded. There's definitely like another layer, but I would say for our purposes, you're pretty much guaranteed to get it back because it really is just a simple SQLite file. I mean, if you were storing a ton of data, if you were stringifying, massive lengths of data and storing it in the database that the underlying tech maybe didn't support, that could be interesting.
But in our simple case of basically just storing form values, we've had no issues with that. We have another question here, which is there a way to secure the data? Very good question. So there are ways to secure the data using Redux Persist so that one can kind of encrypt the data when the data is stored onto the local device. I know that option does exist.
Obviously, you could use any encryption at rest method that you wanted on top of it because you have raw access to how you're storing it, whether it's stringified JSON or whatever you might want to do.
So yes, we can make the data secure. Cool. Any more questions from the Milwaukee group? Awesome. In that case, thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And Bill, do you have any final words?
No, Kaz is going to say some final words, so if you can.
Great. Awesome.
Sure.
Thanks, guys. Hey, I think you guys are actually muted right now. We can't hear you.
Okay, hello, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Oh, there we are. Okay, so we'll do.
Okay, now again.
Wait, now we cannot hear you again.
It should be good.
Just keep it alive.
Okay, yeah, I'll keep it alive. Can you guys hear me? We'll do it one more time.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so we will try it one more time. A big round of applause for all of our presenters. And again, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who came out here in Milwaukee and Chicago. And just because I'm kind of a geek, Chicago, can we hear your love for Milwaukee? Can we get a big hurrah? Can you not hear me again? Hello? Well, you're muted. Okay, and then Milwaukee, we will show Chicago our love. Woo! Okay, so again, everyone's going to do their networking, but thank you so much for kind of collaborating, and hopefully Bill is willing to go through this with me one more time later in the year. But this was awesome, and thank you Northwestern Mutual for the swag and for putting everything together. But yeah, you guys rock, so have a great night. And any feedback, please give Bill over there in Chicago and here in Milwaukee. Let me know what we can do. to keep moving the Midwest forward. So cheers. Bye.